but yeah, sometimes.
Peter, you'll just tell me when everybody's in?
Yes, I will. I'm just going to continue to admit people, so feel free to start whenever you want.
Okay. Okay, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are on the globe. Welcome to our panel on the intergenerational dialogue around water cooperation and peace. We're happy to have you here, and we'll be together for an hour and a half. I'll have to show you something at the beginning based on the request of the organizers, and it is about the policy. Yeah, it's about. Can you see my screen? The anti-discrimination, harassment, and retaliation policy of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. So harassment is in every form is unacceptable. There will be consequences if you witness or are subject to unacceptable behavior. You should be able to contact these people, and all reports will remain strictly confidential. Okay. I will also send you a small message in the chat about the same subject, and I also have to tell you that this, and I will send you also the bios of the speakers, because when I will introduce them, I am the chair of the session, so I will be acting like a traffic cop, and I will be introducing the speakers very, very shortly, but I will send you in the chat a longer biography of every speaker. So then you can learn more about their work, their research areas, and their projects and all their professional activities. So we are here today for a dialogue. We called it intergenerational dialogue. I'd rather want to say that it's a dialogue between early career professionals and more advanced career professionals, because you will see that the speakers do not have a full generation that separates them. And this is probably a good thing. It means that there are more and more people who are taking the flag from scholars who are active, and then the future of water diplomacy is probably being well prepared. It is organized by members of what we call the University's Partnership for Water Cooperation and Diplomacy, the UPWCD. It's a partnership of academic and non-academic institutions that work on capacity and knowledge development in the field of water cooperation and diplomacy. And their objective is actually to enhance knowledge and capacity in this field, and to make an impact on cooperation processes and dialogues that can happen by providing them with the scientific arguments to have a meaningful dialogue, and also by improving the position of this topic in the international political agenda. So it's a network of various institutions I will also send you the website of that network in the chat, and I'll invite every one of you to check the website and see how you can use it and how you can make your network use it as well, and how you can also recommend institutions who respond to the criteria in applying and coming into the network. That website has the ambition to become a one-stop shop for everything you need to know on water cooperation and diplomacy. So you guys have a publication, or are looking for a short course, or are looking for a vacancy, or are looking for an opportunity for collaboration, you should be able to announce it there or have the information there. So I really recommend that you go and check that website and then make it yours, because this is the objective of our main communication tool at the UPWCD. I have to say that that's it for now. So we want to know also during this session, during this dialogue between early career professions and more advanced ones, how this network of institutions can be of use to you, and whether it can make a bridge between various institutions, but also various levels of careers, and how it can be used. Like, what do you expect from such a network, if you think that such a network can be useful to you professionally, or to the institution to which you are affiliated. So with that said, I'm going to start by giving the floor to our first speaker, who is Alexandra Kaplan, who is a PhD candidate at Oregon State University, and she is the manager of the famous Transboundary Freshwater Dispute Database, which houses the world's largest collection of documents relating to the governance of transboundary water resources. She, as early career professional, has been working with Aaron Wolf, professor of geography at Oregon State University. For those who need an introduction of Aaron, so he is also a visiting professor, scholar in water diplomacy at IHE Delft in the Netherlands, and he is the brains behind the UPWCD and also this session. So Alex and Aaron, the floor is yours. You have to unmute yourselves. Are you ready?
Yes, I can go ahead and get started with our presentation, Aaron, if that works. So today I'm going to be starting off our panel with giving everyone a brief snapshot of some global trends happening at transboundary water cooperation, specifically looking at the interstate level. And before I go on, I first want to thank Lina for the introduction and thank everyone for attending our panel. It's great to see so many people joining, and I'm really looking forward to having a great discussion at the end of our session. So as Lena mentioned, I am the manager of the Transboundary Freshwater Dispute Database. It's housed at OSU. And essentially the TFDD houses the world's largest collection of information on transboundary water cooperation and the management and governance of these shared water resources. There's a few different components of the TFDD. And in my presentation today, I'm going to specifically be focusing on an update that we're currently making to the International Freshwater Treaties database. This database houses the world's largest collection of legal documents relating to the governance of internationally shared water resources. Essentially, the purpose of this update is to identify trends, patterns, and challenges in transboundary water cooperation, again, taking a global snapshot of these challenges. Our update has, as it stands, 800 unique agreements this far, and in our review, we have included 667 of these agreements. Just a quick disclaimer, For our purposes, we define an agreement as something that's been concluded between states in written form and governed by international law, whether embodied in a single instrument or in two or more related instruments. So this would include a primary agreement or treaty, as well as its associated documents, so things like amendments, protocols, and replacement treaties. And in my presentation today, I'm going to be talking about some general temporal and spatial trends in transboundary water cooperation, as well as looking more specifically at certain issues. So to start us off, I just want to give a brief overview of some temporal trends in when international freshwater agreements were signed. As you can see on the slide here, we see a very large uptick in the number of agreements that were signed in the 90s across all continents. So if you normalize by number of basins, Asia has the largest number of agreements that's been signed. And we typically, we see a large number of agreements signed in the 90s compared to any other decade, because this decade coincided with the growing awareness of the need for stricter measures to be taken about issues relating to environmental protection and governance of freshwater resources, mostly because there were a lot of global environmental conferences and conventions this decade. And as you'll see later on in my presentation, this pattern repeats itself in a lot of different issues. So this map here shows the number of agreements or documents that have been signed per basin. So again, these are legally binding instruments about the governance of shared water resources. A few interesting trends I want to point out here. The first of which is that most international river basins are governed by at least one agreement. The second of which is larger basins, both geographically speaking and basins with more countries in them, tend to have more agreements signed. The Danube Basin, which spans Central and Eastern Europe, has the largest number of agreements signed. It also has 19 riparian countries, and it has 47 agreements that have been signed within it. Other basins that have large numbers of agreements signed include large, geographically speaking, large basins such as the Nile, the Aral Sea, the La Plata, and the Ganges. A last interesting trend I just want to point out from this map is that the majority of agreements that have been signed tend to be clustered in the global north, so looking at North America and Western Europe, as well as in some global southern countries, especially looking at Southern Africa. This graph here just shows the number of agreements that have been signed in certain issues. So in our database, we code for a lot of different information in treaties. In my presentation today, I'm going to be focusing on the most prevalent issues. So looking at how environmental protection, surface water allocations, and conflict resolution have been addressed. And I'm also going to be looking at stakeholder participation as well. These maps show the spatial distribution of water allocation mechanisms, both by basin and by basin country unit. So the part of the country within a certain river basin. Again, a few general trends I just want to point out from these maps. The first of which is the majority of river basins are governed by at least one allocation mechanism. This is important because research has shown that a lot of water conflicts stem from their water quantity or water allocation disputes. So having an allocation mechanism in place can be a good conflict prevention mechanism. Another interesting trend, again, is that a lot of these allocations tend to be clustered in the global north. So looking specifically at basins like the Colorado and the St. Lawrence in North America, the Danube in Europe, and also the Aral Sea and the Ganges and the Nile tend to have a lot of allocations as well. This is just a brief temporal overlook at how allocations have been addressed over the years. We see a primary peak in the number of allocation mechanisms that were developed first in the 50s, but secondary peak in the 90s and 2000s, again reflecting that greater awareness of environmental protection issues. Allocations can be addressed in a few different ways. The thing I want to point out from this graph, and then I want everyone to take away, is that in the most recent decade, in the 2010s, we see a significant increase in the number of allocations that are based on certain principles, such as equitable and sustainable use. If you compare the gray column in 2010 to all the other decades, there's a much larger number of allocations that have been signed based on these mechanisms. And that's something really interesting to think about. This graph or this map shows the number of, or the distribution of environmental allocations. So there's not a whole lot of agreements that set aside water specifically for environmental purposes, but there are some. And since this is becoming a more important topic, I just wanted to briefly talk about it here. Again, most of the regions where water has been allocated environmentally are in the global north, and as well as in the Aral Sea and the Ganges. Water can be allocated environmentally in a few different ways. It can be allocated for in-stream flow purposes. Countries might set aside a minimum flow to maintain environmental needs. Countries might allocate a certain amount of water to maintain water quality or dilute pollution. And there are even 2 agreements that specifically set aside water to protect groundwater, mostly in the form of putting a cap on groundwater allocation to prevent overexploitation of an aquifer. Another interesting trend that we looked at is the spatial distribution of water quality agreements. So these would be agreements where water quality is the main issue area. 67 basins are governed by at least one water quality agreement. And the spatial distribution of these agreements is much more broad and spread out than it was for the allocation agreements. We see a lot of water quality agreements that have been signed over basins shared between the US and Mexico, but we also see a lot in Africa and in the northern parts of Europe, which is something that we didn't see before. And again, temporally speaking, most of these agreements were signed after the 1990s, reflecting an increased awareness about the need for environmental protection and for more sustainable water management. Environmental protection is another issue that we looked at in our analysis. So environmental protection can be addressed in 3 main ways in agreements. Countries can stipulate that they'll consider environmental issues, generally speaking, in the future. So for example, signing the agreement to help preserve the environment for future generations. Agreements can explicitly mention water quality issues, or they can explicitly mention environmental services or protection. Almost half of the agreements in our update addressed environmental protection in one way or another. And this is really significant. And as you can see, temporally speaking, again, most of these agreements were signed in 1990 or later on, following again that trend that coincided with all these global environmental conventions that were held in the 90s. So stakeholder participation was another trend that we looked at. We define stakeholders as all non-governmental actors mentioned in an agreement. So this would include institutions like NGOs, research institutions, as well as the general public. Not too many agreements mention stakeholder participation, but with a growing awareness that it's important to include stakeholders in water management processes, we felt that it was an important trend to look into. Spatially speaking, there's quite a lot going on here, and we see different spatial distributions of stakeholder participation agreements than we do of other types of agreements. And I think this is really interesting. As you can see, a lot of basins in the global south have agreements that address stakeholder participation. And whether this is due to the fact that these countries might value stakeholder participation more, or whether their negotiations are funded by donors who require the inclusion of these clauses, is beyond the scope of this presentation, but it's certainly worth looking into in future research. And it represents a very interesting and important trend in transboundary water cooperation. And the last trend that we looked at, or the last trend I'm going to be talking about in our presentation that we looked at, was the institutionalization of agreements. So agreements can have a few different institutional design features. They can establish river basin organizations or joint management institutions. They can establish mechanisms for monitoring. They can establish conflict resolution mechanisms, and they can establish enforcement mechanisms, so ways to enforce treaty compliance. And this is important to look at because research has shown that river basins that are governed by highly institutionalized agreements tend to be more resilient to political and environmental change. And as you can see on the graph here, the number of agreements signed with these features embedded in them peaked again in the 90s and has slowly declined in the last 2 decades. So like I said, this presentation was very brief. It's impossible to give an in-depth overlook at what's happening at transboundary water cooperation at the global scale in a really short amount of time. We're going to be publishing a paper on our findings either later this year or early next year, where you'll be able to read more in depth about what I talked about. But this slide just shows some key takeaways I want everyone to take home with them from my presentation. So again, like I've been saying again and again, the 1990s represented a pivotal decade in transboundary water cooperation. We see a peak signing of agreements in this decade. And we also see an increase in agreements that included clauses for things like stakeholder participation, environmental protection, and institutionalization in water quality. And future research can examine how the inclusion of these provisions makes transboundary waters more resilient to climate change and to conflict. And that's all I have for today. Any questions can be addressed to my email on here. You can drop them in the chat, and I'm happy to continue our conversation more in our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Aaron, would you like to add something at this point, because you have both worked together, or shall we move for now to the next pair?
Yeah, I think let's hear from all the researchers, and I can do a summation.
Yeah, but I mean, for this one, we're
no, Alex did a terrific job.
I'm sure she did. Okay, so the next pair comes from the Netherlands. It's Alyssa Offutt. I'm sorry if I massacred your last name. And Susanne Schmeier. So Alyssa is a doctoral candidate at IHE, Delft Institute for Water Education, and Delft University of Technology. She's also a professional engineer with a specialization in contaminant, fate, and transport. And she's the early career professional who worked with Susanne Schmeier, who is an associate professor of water law and diplomacy at IHE as well, Institute for Water Education in Delft. She leads the Water, Peace and Security Partnership, and she has other academic affiliations, which I invite you to check on the link that Peter sent to everyone, where all the biographies are available. For more details about any of our speakers again. So Alyssa and Susan, you have 7 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Lena, for that introduction. Let me go ahead and share my slides. Just to confirm, can everyone see them?
Yes,
Perfect.
Alyssa, they're there.
Thank you. Well, as Lena mentioned, I'm Alyssa Offutt, and I'll be presenting on behalf of Dr. Susanne Schmeier and myself about a topic that we think needs further research and identifies places where the field of hydrodiplomacy is growing. And that includes research into the multiscalar peace building over water quality degradation. So in thinking about what is the state of knowledge so far in existing literature, Alex touched on these analyses that look at these global patterns of events. And research thus far has indicated that there are interactions over water quality, but they're limited in comparison to other topic areas, so ranging from about 6 to 10% by 2008. However, of these interactions, they're primarily cooperative. And there's various theories for that, including that water quality is a creeping problem with incremental changes that can be absorbed by the capacity of the basin states, as well as the idea that water quality may follow issues of water allocation. So it really only becomes a major topic in areas where there is concerns over water quantity, and then water quality becomes relevant because of its contribution to water stress. And these findings generate a couple of underlying assumptions, including that water quality facilitates cooperation, independent of other relationships in the basin, that these topics are primarily the purview of the state and include the state as the only actors. And as well, it indicates that there might be limited impacts of water quality that are really only relevant in instances of quantity stress. However, we know that there have been patterns of tensions that occur over water quality And as well, there's a couple of other aspects to this topic that we think merit a deeper analysis. And I'll introduce a couple of them. The first of which is the changing state of ambient water quality. It's anticipated that approximately 80% of transboundary river basins are severely affected by pathogens and nutrients alone, and that this degradation will continue through 2030. However, we also know that there is widespread impacts of more toxic contaminants, such as heavy metals, although the distribution is poorly understood. And while this topic of water quality has traditionally had limited data, attention, and funding, there have been global efforts to really bring visibility to the issue and put it more in the political sphere, requiring a response. So these widespread impacts, greater visibility, and potential for rapid change as a result of extreme events and contaminant thresholds indicate that there might be increasing pressure from water quality that can stress or shift the interactions between basin states over water quality impacts. In addition to this, in states where there are positive interactions, the analyses have been primarily limited in geographic scope, and there's been some narratives about how the relationships evolve, indicating that water quality can be an entry point to peace building, such as over the Sava River Basin, or response to flashpoints and public pressure, such as the Sandoz chemical spill in the Rhine. However, there's not yet been a systematic analysis of how these interactions evolve and also how they relate to other interactions within the basin. So for instance, giving us the opportunity to evaluate, does water quality tend to beget cooperation? And if so, is it used to build positive relationships when there's other sources of tension within the basin? In addition, these analyses have not yet linked the actual patterns of interactions that occur to the specific chemicals that are impacting the basins at the time. And finally, as Alex very nicely highlighted, there has been a lot of growing inclusion of water quality provisions in transboundary agreements, and spanning up to, as she mentioned, 67 basins. However, preliminary analysis have indicated that the provisions are not necessarily substantive or comprehensive, and therefore might not enable countries to fully address the water quality impacts that are occurring. Simultaneously, where commitments are made, there are innate challenges in implementing these commitments in the context of water quality that are related to both the high requirements of infrastructure and financial resources needed, as well as the long residence time of contaminants in the environment. And as a result, these can then prolong the impacts and over time can maybe shift the relationships that were initially cooperative over water quality as it continues to affect the basin states. And together, these all require that a greater analysis of water quality and hydrodiplomacy between states be conducted. But it's important to note that, of course, water quality not only affects states and the state representatives, but also the basin communities themselves. Almost every use of water is affected by water quality, and it can have severe ramifications for public health, water and food security, livelihoods, the environmental protection, and as well as quality of life. And these impacts are not always felt equitably as a result of proximity to contamination, different factors that affect vulnerability and body burdens, including adaptive capacity, as well as procedural and recognitional equity. So not only are there impacts on water quality in transboundary basins, but they also beget questions of environmental justice. And what we see is there are local behavioral responses to these transboundary impacts. And there have been observed patterns of conflict and violent conflict in some transboundary basins, as well as migration and cooperation in response to water quality and the environmental justice that occurs. Along this line, there's also been a lot of mobilization of civil society in response to water quality impacts. So we've seen stakeholders participating in formal representation, such as the stakeholder engagement Alex mentioned, as well as protests, and even stakeholders joining litigation against upstream states. And this creates a bottom-up pressure that can simultaneously shape hydropolitical interactions and aligns with Putnam's two-level game theory. And so while there have been some empirical research that have looked at the role of non-state actors, particularly NGOs, in shaping interactions with the state, the both top-down influence of water quality on affecting local communities, as well as the ability of these actors to pressure the state, requires more of a multi-scalar analysis to unpack how water quality impacts transboundary basins. And so this leads to our final area that we really think requires more research, which is an analysis of the relationship between water quality, conflict, cooperation, and environmental justice at multiple scales. And we're currently addressing this by looking at a 3-part research project that both looks at the interactions of water quality interactions in relation to other conflict and cooperation in the basin at the level of the state, linking these interactions to specific water quality impacts, and then finally unpacking the state to look at the effectiveness and equity that underlie transboundary cooperation in the reduction of water quality risks and how that contributes to behavioral responses at multiple levels of scale. And we believe that by building this understanding, this can support improved governance and also reduce water quality risks that can then facilitate more sustained cooperation. And we'll address questions in the panel discussion, but of course, you're also always welcome to email us if you have any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. We're now transitioning to the next pair, Renata and Melissa. They're both working at, they're both affiliated to the Fletcher School. Renata is the early career scholar who is graduate from Fletcher School at Tufts, and she's a research assistant at the Center of Environmental Resource Policy. And Melissa is an assistant professor of international environmental policy, also at Tufts University. She also is collaborating on additional projects aimed at monitoring hydropolitical tension and identifying factors that contribute to potential conflict or cooperation. Again, you can scroll up and find their bios in the chat. Renata and Melissa, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you, Elena, for your kind introduction. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being today with us. And just to build on Alex and Alicia's presentations, we'll talk about the role of groundwater in agreements. The purpose of our presentation is to show how we are doing in terms of tracking and monitoring trends in groundwater and how freshwater agreements address groundwater specifically and also conjunctively use of groundwater and surface water in agreements. So our goal for today is to introduce a new coding methodology and talk about two sets of results with how treaties deal with groundwater and surface water agreements and groundwater only agreements. To start with, this map illustrates the importance of transboundary aquifer that two presenters mentioned earlier. There are nearly 600 aquifers and groundwater bodies. And with climate change and increasing demand of surface water, we are going to see more stress placed on transboundary aquifer, which require more cooperation and agreements on transboundary aquifer. The sample for this analysis are 581 agreements. This is not the total number. We excluded entries that do not meet the criteria, or coding hasn't been completed yet, or there were some missing data. We derived our breakdown on how groundwater should be addressed in the agreement from Lautzer's 2018 paper, and adoption is broken down here in this slide. So for the code, surface water only means that the primary focus is surface water. And groundwater mentioned only code shows that surface water is not mentioned and water is not primarily focus of the agreement. In contrast, groundwater mentioned groundwater, in contrast, the groundwater only is for agreements that exclusively focus on groundwater, and substantive coverage of both mean that surface and groundwater are addressed in details, including how each will be managed. And primarily focused water code focuses predominantly on surface water and provide only vague reference to groundwater. And primarily groundwater is vice versa. And light reference means that last one is that groundwater and surface water are only lightly referenced with the larger topic of the agreement. So as you see in this chart, most of the agreements are only talk about groundwater. And the ones that do talk about groundwater, which is this part of a pie, are predominantly focused on surface water, and very few mention groundwater in another format, and very, very few mention groundwater only, which is here. This is actually not 0%. It's about 16 groundwater treaties, but with overall percentage rounding, it shows as 0. Of these agreements that address groundwater, we specifically looked on adding several additional codes which are specific to groundwater that we think are important. First one is essentially we attempt to identify and link them spatially through IRAC data, and aquifer description identifies whether the treaty attempts to characterize, describe, or model aquifer in some way or form. Consideration of future use, this is really kind of forward-looking code, thinking about how change in supply and demand will impact groundwater in the future. For sustainable use, we try to capture documents that thinking about how states thinking about sustainable practices with respect to groundwater. This can also include safe yield or mentioning of sustainable management of water resources. Since groundwater and aquifers are susceptible to long-term contamination, we also thought it was very important to track how treaties are dealing with potential pollutants and water quality issues that Alyssa mentioned as well. And reason why we included sovereignty code is because the draft article on the law of transboundary aquifer, they include provisions that states have sovereignty over aquifer on their respective territories. We looked more broadly on how the treaties deal with sovereignty that address groundwater, whether sovereignty over aquifer or limited sovereignty or other way. And lastly, allocation. For allocation, we wanted to see if states thinking how they want to allocate their groundwater. We'll discuss it more in details later in the presentation. So this graph illustrates finding of additional codes for groundwater. So light blues you see under each code are represent number of treaties that do mention the issues, and dark blue are the ones that do not. And as you can see, not many groundwater aquifer treaties address those issues in details, and the ones that do mainly focus on sustainable use and groundwater pollution and quality issues. With that, I will transition to Professor McCracken.
Thank you, Renata. So we can move to the next slide. And I'm just going to talk a little bit more about the groundwater allocation specific code. Alex introduced that as part of our update that's ongoing with the broader transboundary freshwater treaties database. But specifically looking at groundwater, we ended up separating the allocation code into looking at both allocation mechanisms for surface water as well as for groundwater specifically. And so in addition to separating allocation mechanisms out so we can track how treaties are looking at allocating both sources of water, we also identified several different types of potential allocation mechanisms that treaties might utilize that are specific to groundwater sources. And so we've included these codes, including monitoring allocation based off pumping rates, or determining based off water table impact, or measuring spring outflow, for example, and see if there's impact to a spring outflow somewhere in the basin, and then whether or not they're allocating the entire aquifer or the pore space, or so forth. As of right now, we actually haven't seen any treaties utilizing a groundwater specific allocation mechanism. They tend to just use the same types of mechanisms that we find with surface water. But overall, we've seen that there's 42 agreements that actually have a groundwater specific allocation mechanism. Only 12 of these agreements just allocate groundwater. And so the remainder allocate both surface water and groundwater. What we've generally seen, which I think is in line with what Alex has presented, is that we have seen a shift towards these principle-based mechanisms. And with respect to groundwater, we see that the how that they're allocating the water, if you will, or what we identify as the practical element, is that they utilize the principle of equitable and reasonable use, or the principles of sustainable use with respect to allocation. And generally, we see that there's no specific purpose for allocation defined as the dominant category, and then the next most common is with respect to domestic or municipal uses. So next slide, please. So just to wrap up our presentation, as Alex mentioned, the broader treaties database is ongoing, and this groundwater component is a key piece of that. So we're continuing to collect agreements and translate new agreements and code these into the data set. So we'll be seeing hopefully some new updates and trends moving forward. So we welcome any recommendations and feedback you might have regarding the new coding, specifically for groundwater. And we always welcome any assistance in locating and identifying new agreements for inclusion in the data set. So please don't hesitate to send that to us as well. Next slide. So I'd like to thank you all. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to either Renata or I.
Thank you so much, Melissa and Renata. Thank you very much. So just to relay everybody's requests in the chat, everyone is asking for everyone else's PowerPoints. So if there are no objections from the speakers, maybe I can tell that we can make these PowerPoints available, or maybe the forthcoming publications also the references available when they'll be absolutely actually on the UPWCD website. You'll have to come on the UPWCD website to get those the publications when they're out, and in the meantime the organizers will make sure that the PowerPoints are available if the speakers have no objection. Now it's the turn of our next pair, Hannah Hilbert-Wolf and Christian Brethaut from the University of Geneva. So Hannah is also, I mean, she works with Christian at the University of Geneva, but she's also currently a lecturer at Washington State University, and she leads the research and analysis team at a nonprofit organization called Geology for Global Development. And Christian is a professor at the University of Geneva, and he is the director of the education and knowledge component of the Geneva Water Hub, who is now hosting and coordinating the university's partnership for water cooperation and diplomacy. And he is also the co-director of a UNESCO chair on hydropolitics at the University of Geneva. Hannah, the floor is yours. I know you want 8 minutes instead of 7. Everybody else is taking a little bit longer, so please not too much longer, okay?
Okay, I'll be as efficient as possible. Here, I'm just sharing the screen, and hopefully it's full screen now. Is that right? Okay, super. Thanks a lot. Well, thank you very much, Elena, and hi, everybody. I'm Hannah Hilbert-Wolf, and I'm presenting work done in collaboration, as Lena said, with Christian Brethaut and also with Fatine Esbach. And I just want to point out that at this point in the session, we've just had some wonderful global overviews, and now we're switching to a bit of a case study approach. And so Christian, Fatine, and I have been studying what are called friendship dams. And this is a quite explicit materialization of friendship and hydropolitics that may illustrate the potential role of water in peace, yet which are quite underexplored. And so this work began as my master's thesis research while at the University of Geneva and also the Geneva Water Hub under the guidance of Christian. And the three of us are now carrying this research forward with a paper forthcoming. And so what I'm presenting today is our preliminary understandings. Like we did, you might first be asking yourself, what's a friendship dam? And there's currently no established definition. So we've compiled the characteristics of the 9 friendship dams worldwide that are known to us to start to make some observations. What we've observed is that there's a number of strikingly different characteristics. So for example, some friendship dams are between riparian states and others between non-riparians. Some have been financed via foreign aid, like the Ambuli Friendship Dam, and others via cost-sharing agreements. There's even the case of the dam between the US and Mexico, which was originally called Diablo, but which was renamed Amistad, or Friendship Dam. We also don't know what friendship dams mean empirically. The Afghan Indian Friendship Dam, for example, has reportedly led to increased tensions. So via the work that we're undertaking at the moment, we want to gain a greater clarity in what friendship dams mean and better understand the politics that sit behind them. And in so doing, we realize that it's going to be essential to understand the particularities of different cases and bring these understandings together. And we also see this work as giving us the opportunity to perhaps open up new theoretical avenues, for example, by seeing if and what value there is in the cross-fertilization of theoretical lenses such as international relations, hydropolitics, and diplomacy. Here we are. So to answer some of these questions, we've taken a case study approach, as I mentioned before, and we first are looking at the Syria-Turkey Friendship Dam by focusing on identifying the key political variables that structured the cooperation over the dam and led to its friendship label. And this was a fruitful dam to begin with because it's one of the few friendship dams that's addressed in the literature, although largely from a water-focused perspective. And there's also quite a rich body of hydropolitical analyses that have been published from the region as well. The Syria-Turkey Friendship Dam is intended to be a multi-purpose dam, importantly to protect regions of Turkey from severe flooding. And although there's not time to narrate the whole story of its history, a few key dates are the 1960s, when Turkey first suggested building a dam near the two countries' border, 2004, when then Prime Minister Erdogan formally proposed the dam, 2009, when Syria and Turkey signed a memoranda of understanding for the dam, and actually in 2011, a foundation stone was laid for the dam, but this was just before violence broke out in the region, and interestingly, the dam has yet to be built. Understanding the history of this part of the border between Syria and Turkey is quite important to contextualizing the friendship dam. The region is known as Hatay or Iskenderun, and it's a disputed territory. You can see on this historical Turkish map on the left that the region belongs to Turkey. But if we look at a historical Syrian map on the right, we see that the region is considered Syrian. And this has implications for the Asi Orontes River, on which the dam is to be built. On the map on the left, the river is transboundary, and on the map on the right, it's Syrian. And the border dispute has led Syria to consider this river a domestic river until the early 2000s, and we'll talk more about that later. So the importance of this historical context becomes clear, and in order to understand why the dam crystallized, we used a framework of historical institutionalism to understand the process that led to this dam. You can see from the timeline at the top that there's an ebb and flow in cooperation over water between the two countries that's correlated with their high-level political relations. And this is an observation that's been noted by others as well. After an initial period of low tensions, then in the 1950s through to the 1990s, phase 2, bilateral tensions rose. This is partially due to the Cold War and partially also because Syria and Turkey undertook large dam building campaigns. So for example, the GAP. And what happened next was that a series of security and water protocols encouraged cooperation again just at the turn of the century. So in 1987, protocols were signed linking these two issues, water and security, as Syria promised to stop supporting the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, and Turkey pledged to share water from the Euphrates. The two countries signed the Adana Accords in 1998, which served to strengthen bilateral relations as well, and importantly opened up what we're calling this window of opportunity in which the friendship dam concept was developed and acted upon. I've lost a slide here. I think my computer's slow. There we are. So what we've pulled out from the historical analysis so far is that both the variables of security and also the dynamics of international cooperation have been key in this case to the development of the friendship dam. What we learned from the analysis is that historically security concerns have triggered large-scale shift in high-level relations and that water has been linked to security. So we can recall the 1987 protocols and also the Adana Agreement, for example. Security is a concept that's been linked to international friendship in the literature as well. And in this particular case, we see a strategic friendship. So where Turkey and Syria both have a stake in physically manifesting their declaration of friendship via the friendship dam to ensure security in light of events like the US and Iraq, the PKK, etc. We can see the importance of the other factor, the dynamics of international cooperation, if we take a closer look at this window of opportunity. So we find that it's not just about water. We see plenty of other factors that influence the cooperation process, and we see water embedded within them. For example, in addition to security issues that were discussed previously, cooperation was impacted by a change in government in both countries, who then changed their approach to foreign relations. Particularly significant was Turkey's Justice and Development Party's philosophy to have no problems with neighbors during this time. Also, in terms of the dynamics of international cooperation, it becomes evident that a multi-scalar perspective is important. So, for example, Turkey was interested in joining the EU at this time, and on a bilateral level, the two countries needed to define a border to establish the boundaries for their free trade agreement, etc. So what's also essential to this story is where Syria and Turkey positioned themselves at a topic and at what moment. And we can see that the narrative changes through time. The willingness to cooperate is dependent on government's particular foreign policy strategy and political positioning, which is impacted by events that are ongoing. At the end of the day, all of this seems to have led to the establishment of the Friendship Dam, which was just one of a package of 50 memoranda of understanding that were signed together by Syria and Turkey at a meeting of their bilateral high-level strategic cooperation council. So there is a multiplicity of processes at play, and this is what we mean when we say the dynamics of international cooperation is central to understanding the Friendship Dam process. So if we reflect back on our objectives, we can conclude thus far that in order to define and understand the meanings of friendship dams, it's going to be essential to look closely at many different cases and to understand the diversity. For this case, we're able to identify two key factors that influence the process that led to the friendship dam, security, and the dynamics of international cooperation, and future work on other cases will allow for a comparative analysis. And in terms of a contribution to the theory, we see that there's value in cross-fertilization of the theoretical lenses of hydropolitics, international relations, and diplomacy. And we see the importance of going beyond the water box when understanding the intersection of water and peace. And this case also illustrates the value of a historical perspective to understanding current hydropolitical situations. So thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to the discussion later.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you. And now, without transition, once again, because in the interest of time, I'm going to invite the last pair, Clara Ramin and Olivia Sylvester. Clara is an alumni from the Environment, Development and Peace program at the University for Peace, and Olivia is the head of the Environment, Development and Peace department at the same university. After the presentation of Olivia and Clara, Aaron Wolf will take a look at the past effort that was done, and then a look at the future and at the present and future research work that is being done now in this dialogue between various scholars in their different stages of career. So Olivia and Clara, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elena, and to all the participants and the organizers of the panel. So we're going to go a little bit more specific into the field where we are here in Costa Rica, and we're going to talk about water politics in agricultural landscapes. And to start, what we'll illustrate today is how industrial landscapes will see how extractivist perceptions of water and lack of regulation has led to community members and nature bearing unfair burdens of environmental crises. And then we'll conclude by showing how community strengths are currently addressing these injustices. And we wanted to define water politics a little bit more broadly as the allocation of values with respect to water use in society. It's based on perception, and that's key in our research. Depending on that perception, it can lead to different relationships with natural resources, and in this case, water and land. And water politics is really important in agriculture, as you'll see, since this practice uses the highest proportion of our global water resources. So just thinking in terms of irrigation, study shows that water irrigation for ag can use between 60 and 90% of water resources in one country, depending upon that country. Our case studies from Costa Rica, where we're located, and you can see this red arrow points to the south of Costa Rica, and we can hone in a little bit here. And this is a case study from Buenos Aires, a county that's actually covered fully with pineapple. 9,000 hectares of this county is covered, and that's around 13,000 soccer fields for you to imagine. There's high social and cultural capital in this area, but there's also the highest social inequality and poverty rates in the country. And the pineapple produced here is for export. And the production is run by a subsidiary of a transnational corporation that you might all know, which is Del Monte. So here we're talking a little bit about water use and sharing of resources and the justice issues around that and the water politics. And we're thinking about transnational in terms of not only the production in Costa Rica, but also the export and consumption of these companies in the global north. So go ahead now, Clara.
Thank you, Olivia. So pineapple in Costa Rica is one of the most pesticide-intensive crops and is related to a series of social environmental problems. There is deforestation, biodiversity loss, soil contamination, human health problems, food insecurity, and dangerous working conditions. But the presence of Del Monte in the region has also been critiqued because the company has gained power over the local water resources, leading to communities' water insecurity. And the communities bordering plantations experience decreased water availability, as well as they face water contamination issues in the rivers and aquifers used for consumption, recreation, and for small-scale farming. Next slide, please. So with our case study, we emphasize three key issues of the current water politics in agro-industrial pineapple landscapes in the south of Costa Rica. The first one is that the intensive water use of pineapple of the pineapple company decreases the water availability in the region. Next slide, please. Pineapple monocropping depends on large water consumption for irrigation during the dry season. And for that reason, concessions have been made to use water from surrounding basins according to the volume of water. Del Monte owns the majority of river water concessions in Costa Rica, through that the government allows the company to take 90% of a river's water flow. And in the south, the company owns 98% of all the river water concessions. So 1,300 liters water per second are taken from the 3 biggest rivers in the county. And that means that the water that is taken from those rivers within 1 minute is enough to supply one Costa Rican citizen during 13 months with water. And the rivers are losing water flow year by year, but the communities depend on the river water for domestic use, drinking water, and recreation, as well as small-scale farming. So in the future, the social use of a river and the fact that water flows are decreasing needs to be considered when water concessions are granted to the companies, and the communities and activists must be included in the decision of where and how much water can be taken from the river. Next slide. So the second point is that the unregulated expansion of the pineapple plantations and the high chemical use affect the water quality for rural communities. There is a lack of control of the state that facilitates the further expansion of pineapple and the continuity of land use change. In Buenos Aires, pineapple are grown everywhere. So you can see them up in the mountains, close to important water springs. They are close to the rivers and down bordering with a Ramsar wetland. And in the rainy season, the high precipitation washes the soils and causes erosion and sedimentation. And so that means that untreated agricultural runoff contaminates the water resources. And in the northern part of the area of Costa Rica, not where we are right now, but in the northern part, bromacil and other chemicals have been found in the aquifers that have been used for domestic consumption. And additionally, there are pineapple plantations within protected areas, which are important wetlands. And apart from the environmental damage caused by sedimentation and the agrochemicals, families that used to fish in these wetlands are losing the possibility of maintaining their living. So in the future, a regulatory plan is needed where community members have a say about where pineapple can be grown. And then the third point on the next slide is the increasing role of global alliances in leading the dialogue around watershed management. So recently an alliance was signed between Del Monte and the German cooperation agency called GIZ. And this public-private partnership is presented as a global model to follow and has the potential to be influential in the management of water resources. But unfortunately, besides the multiple sustainable certificates that Del Monte has received, a main goal of the alliance is now to ensure the availability of water, but for the company, and highlights the leadership of Del Monte and the GIZ in managing the watershed. And so these power dynamics between state, industry, and global alliances with extractivist perceptions of water show how communities and nature in the global south disproportionately shoulder the burdens of environmental crises. Next slide. So for many people and communities, nature is more than a resource. It is the territory and it is the fabric that builds identity. And for this reason, many of the defenses of the common goods in Costa Rica are tied to the rivers because the river is part of their identity. And in the county of Buenos Aires, there is high cultural and social capital, as Olivia had mentioned. And that is how farmers, community members, ecologists, youth, and women's group were able to build local and national alliances that fight for water conservation and justice. As a result, since 2017, the use of bromacil is now forbidden in national territory. In 2019, a permit that had been given by the Ministry of Environment that allowed Del Monte to plant 600 hectares of pineapple within the Terra-Sierpe Ramsar wetland was annulled after big protests. And in the community, with most hectares of pineapple planted, a basin commission was formed to discuss solutions for the basin protection. Also, there were over 60 private hydroelectric dam projects that were canceled in the south due to community protests. And one community called Longomai has declared 450 hectares of land, which is half of its territory, protected rainforest, which now serves as a green lung in between of the monocultures. Olivia?
Oh, I was muted. Yeah, I'm here. So thank you very much, Clara. So just in conclusion, we gave an overview of what it means to consider first our perceptions of water use and how that plays out in agro-industrial landscapes. And so we highlight that for water politics to have a justice lens, we need to highlight the diversity of perceptions, as Clara said, including those of community activists that are fighting for more peaceful relationships with water and with nature.
Thank you so much, Clara and Olivia. I think it should not be allowed for people to to live in a place where they make a presentation and then we hear all sorts of birds singing behind them. This is very nice to hear. It makes us travel a little bit. It's a little bit unfair, but I hope you're enjoying it. So Aaron, I would like to call upon you now. We have heard all these presentations and it feels like we have come a long way since you started making your research in the topic. Can you look a little bit, take us a little bit backwards and then look a little bit forward, help us look to the future?
Yeah. Thank you, Lena. And one of my joys today has been to hear you try and avoid the word "old" when you're talking about me. But one does get a certain perspective year after year, and it's very exciting to hear this. All of this cutting edge research into directions that I never would have been able to do. So as Lena said, I got my PhD in 1992, and at the time it was very, very different in terms of transboundary waters. There was so little activity, maybe a couple of researchers around the world. The World Bank hadn't been involved since the Indus Treaty in 1960. GIZ was a little bit involved in Southern Africa, but there was next to no systematic research at all. And then there was a very influential set of papers by a guy named Thomas Homer Dixon in the early 1990s, where he started to talk about this issue of environmental security and violence. And he famously said the renewable resource most likely to stimulate interstate resource war is river water. And this really caught on, not just in academia, but the security establishment picked this up. Al Gore was vice president at the time, and he started a project called Project Medea, where he would try and declassify earth science information so that they could identify future environmental conflicts. Our National Intelligence Council set up an environmental center to focus on environmental conflict. And the whole focus really was around conflict. And I think something that Hannah and Christiane mentioned, although water people tend to think of water as the center of the universe, we need to remember that there are other streams of thought going on around us. And at the time, we need to remember this was the end of the Cold War, and the security establishment was desperate to find a new mission for itself. We were talking in the US about a peace dividend, that we would take money from the military and start to fund social programs at schools and hospitals. And of course, the security people had other ideas of what ought to be done with our budget. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it resonated so much. And this was the world that I and a number of others, including Lena, started to walk into, and kind of looked at this narrative of environmental conflict and water wars. And as scientists, we asked, okay, what do you know? What do we really know? And recognizing that they totally forgot to ask about cooperation. So all of the things that are indicating conflict also indicate cooperation. And we and others started to count different events. And so that was kind of the next shift, is there was this dueling narratives of conflict versus cooperation. And then the London School came about, and to remind us, both can happen at once. And not only are relationships both conflictive and cooperative, this is people like Mark Zaitoun, Jeroen Warner, Naho Muromachi, but not all cooperation is good, not all conflict is bad. Sometimes agreements cement power inequities. And so I think this also resonated in a major way and reminded us of the nuance. And I think the next shift is Susanne Schmeier and the Water, Peace and Security Project at IHE Delft, looking at the subnational sets of issues. And we heard some of that today, because the dynamics at the subnational level are very, very different than the international level. But again, we need to recognize that that's resonating in part because the Northern Hemisphere is very concerned about immigration from the Southern Hemisphere. And so recognizing the resonance of water, peace, and security to larger issues of poverty alleviation and migration are important to recognize. So now this gets us, I think, to where we are, where we hear these wonderful presentations. We now have political scientists involved and social scientists involved. We're looking at groundwater and water quality, a whole host of issues that weren't on the agenda at the time. And so the question is, where do we go from here? I think there are a couple of different things. Certainly the pessimists, including the press and the politicians, will point to climate change, say, sure, there haven't been wars thus far, but everything's going to change. And I think maybe climate change is definitely changing our idea of what stable is. But I think conversely, we're also getting much, much better at water diplomacy. The examples, this network of universities, all of the different aid agencies have transboundary water programs focused on institutions rather than hardware. We have satellite data that used to be you could keep your dam secret and your river flow secret. And that's just not possible anymore. We have citizen science. People with their cell phones can keep much better track of data, certainly than anything that was possible in the past. So I think there are trends in both directions, making things more difficult, but also giving us better toolbox. And I think this network of research and of both applied and theoretical research is bringing us into the future. Just some of the topics I think will make things more difficult. Some are new issues. Microplastics, I don't even know how you get them out of water, and they're absolutely everywhere. So this is something to keep an eye on. Some of the issues are the same things we've always dealt with. There's these big infrastructure. We thought the era of large dams was over. And we in China, we've been looking at the rivers flowing south, and we forget about basins like the Irtysh basin between China and Russia and Kazakhstan. They have a massive diversion project to bring snowmelt internally into China so that the river will no longer flow to the north. The biggest tunnel in the world. I mean, the era of macro projects is not over, but also some issues are profoundly new. I heard wonderful research, not wonderful, it was painful research. A guy named Stu Mata at the University of Amsterdam, he was talking about carbon credits, and apparently one of the things that the Paris process has encouraged is more dam building, because that's nominally clean energy. And so again, if we look in China, suddenly they have a surplus of power on their transboundary rivers, which in turn is encouraging smelters and, of all things, cryptocurrency mining. These are not issues that we were thinking about, back in the 90s when it was a question of conflict or cooperation. So I think I'm generally heartened. I'm generally an optimist. I listen to the research that's going on here, and I'm hugely excited that there is this network young scholars and us old scholars who get to still do some of our work. But I think the combination of threats, new threats on the horizon, but also much richer toolkit that we have will, and the new engagement of whole schools of thought and many more people interested in these issues. I think in the end of the day, I'm generally heartened and feel that we will be able to deal with the challenges that come about. So thank you all, and it's really a pleasure to listen to the young scholars and their older advisors. So
no, they're advanced scholars, advanced career scholars. Thank you so much, Aaron. Thank you for making this, for giving us this overview of where the evolution and the progress that has been made for the past decades now, we can say, it is heartening to see that there is a new army that is going to take the flag and defend it. Once again, in the chat, there is a link to the UPWCD, a link to the bios, a link to the Transboundary Freshwater Database, and my email in case you want to be in touch with one of the speakers. I'm not going to distribute their emails. Some of them put it in their slides, but some of them did not. So you can get in touch with me if you want to be in touch with any one of them, and then I will make sure this happens. And now we have 11 minutes left, but if you are all in agreement, we can maybe go over the time a little bit. If you have questions, the Zoom is open, but please put on your videos because it would be nicer for the speakers to see you if you have questions. Anyone? Thank you. Nice to see faces that we know. So I have a question maybe for Hannah and Christian. I was wondering, in the Friendship Dam, for example, I saw that you have a column with the signatory, with the signing parties, and then a column for those who are involved. But then, what is the impact of such Friendship Dam on countries that are not involved, but that are riparian of the basin? I'm thinking of the Orontes because I know it. I wouldn't be able to say something else about another one. But for the Orontes, for example, Lebanon is the upstream country, and does it have any impact? The fact that it is not present, does it have an impact on the Friendship Dam, or is it better not to have it at the table? Can you tell us where this falls in the research?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question, Lena. I guess I can provide some context, but probably not answer the question. So I'll start with the Asi Orontes. So this is the river where the Turkey-Syria Friendship Dam is, 2B, by the way. So the dam hasn't been built yet. And so what we were looking at is the process that led up to the agreement to build the dam, but all of that was halted in 2011 when the violence broke out in the region. So we don't know what impact it may have in the future, but that's a really interesting space for further research, indeed, because the other dams have been built largely, of the other 9. What's interesting in the Asi Orontes is that there is no tripartite agreement. So there is no agreement between Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey. And those are the 3, as you said, the 3 riparians. And so, yeah, absolutely, that has had impact. It's had impact on how the river's been governed and managed throughout its history. And we don't know, I suppose, what impact the dam will have just because it hasn't been built yet. But we, or at least myself, I don't know so much about the other cases, but and there's not too much in the literature, but what you can read about the Afghan-Indian Friendship Dam, for example, is that this has perhaps caused tensions between other riparians that aren't directly involved in the dam. And so that's a really interesting dynamic for an infrastructure labeled friendship. So those would be my my insights. Not very, I can't answer that directly. I'm not sure if Christian or Fatin has anything else to add.
No, not really. I think you did a great job answering. The only point I wanted to add is indeed that we try to do is to trace the influence of other actors in the process. So this is why we adopted this historical perspective, looking at what kind of actors intervene in the process and sometimes allows to solve like an ongoing issue, or in the contrary, to block the situation. So this is also why we value this historical institutionalism lens to understand this type of process and to understand the role of each of the actors in the long-term process.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both. Thank you. Would anyone else want to ask a question? I think anyway, one good move was to change the name of this Diablo dam, right? It was not very welcome. So I don't see. Oh, Kozik, Gosh, your hand is raised.
Yeah, hello everyone. It was a nice, panel discussions I have ever had. So I have one question in my mind. Means I'm a researcher and a faculty member who is working on a Himalayan transboundary river basin. So thinking more about the climate change issue that transboundary cooperation means sharing water. So why not the sharing challenges too that climate change may create in future, or it is creating basically, and making all the old treaties unsustainable because old treaties did not consider climate change as the issues that may hamper or affect the water resources. So this is what the question. So anyone if would like to highlight on the climate change issues on the water sharing.
Thank you, Kozik. Maybe I can take another two questions because I see Ida's hand is raised, and then there is a question in the chat. What is quality or allocation relevancy to the human right to water and ecological flow balance? How far to shift the energy and industry priorities? So the panelists, please, you can consider this, and the question of Kozik about the fact that about sharing the challenges of climate change and not only the benefits. Then I have Ida and Sigfrido lining up. Please go ahead, Ida.
Yeah, thank you very much all for your presentations. I learned a lot again. I guess my question is mainly directed Clara, because you were mentioning your third point that lack of global alliances gaining influence in watershed management, and the GZ and Del Monte signing an alliance, which was rather helping the company and not necessarily the community in water allocation stuff. And I was curious if you could elaborate a bit more on that, because it seems very hypocritical, and I was wondering if that is happening more, and how this was put in the project of the GIS also in the end. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ida. We'll hear Sigfrido's question.
Right. Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for the colleagues. I'm based here in South Sudan. So South Sudan is one of the youngest countries in the world. And we have a transboundary water management treaty with Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt. I wonder if eventually the panelists can update me on eventually how this agreement can be I would say revitalized, how eventually we can engage the stakeholders, considering the fact that there is political instability right now in Sudan. There are always issues with the Ethiopians concerning the Nile, the other branch of the Nile. And I would be pleased also to know how eventually this platform can foster the dialogue, especially for African countries where looking at the Congo River Basin, the Nile Basin, how the platform eventually can further support the discussion with government authorities. I really appreciate on this platform a very wide number of colleagues with very wide knowledge. I want to go beyond this platform and to understand how eventually we can continue the discussion and capitalize on this opportunity of sharing information. I also build my question on the fact I've been working in Afghanistan on the Amu Darya. I know the Asio-Rontos River when I was at the border with Syria, and now I'm here in South Sudan. And this is water is a very important issue. It's a weapon. It's not longer oil as it was a couple of years ago. Now it's water. So I want to understand how eventually we can make sure governments can continue capitalizing on the fact we have these agreements, and we have to make these agreements more operational rather than simply a piece of paper on the table. And I understand again and compliment to you all dear colleagues for la crème de la crème you are putting on this table. Eventually, I will be pleased to take bilateral discussions, conversation with whoever can help me making this discussion a little bit further and move forward. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Sigfrido. Maybe for now we can make a tour and then see among the panelists who would like to pick up the questions. Maybe is there anyone who wants to jump in, or shall I just? Yeah, we have to close the room at the latest 5 minutes past 6:30. So please, we have 5 minutes. Who would like to jump in from the panel? Aaron? Olivia? Not Aaron? Alex, you have a question that is directly addressed to you in the chat. Go ahead, please.
Oh, well, to save time's sake, I was actually in the middle of typing my response to the question in the chat. So
Okay.
I'll save my response for that one, but I would also like to address Kaushik's question. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name really quickly. You talked about how could we address issues relating to climate change. And one thing that I'm thinking of is that climate change is posing a huge issue in terms of water allocation. So just uncertainty and knowing about, how much water will be available from one year to the next or one growing season to the next because of climate change can make allocating water very difficult. And one way that this has been addressed at the international level, looking at international agreements and how water is allocated, is that countries are starting to establish and create flexible allocation mechanisms. So countries might, for instance, allocate water based on availability. Instead of just allocating fixed amounts or volumes of water, they're now starting to favor allocating water based on either the time of year or water availability. And this can help, prioritize water for certain sectors, given they can look at how much water is available. There's a treaty in the Maputo and Nkomati basins in Southern Africa that I think it's between those, covers those basins. And they essentially have a water allocation mechanism that varies based on like the growing season. So during the growing season, they'll allocate a certain amount of water. And then in the season where the fields are fallow, they'll allocate a different amount of water to account for, how much water people are using for agriculture. And they also set aside like a reserve amount of water in case of things like droughts and unforeseen emergencies due to climate change. So we're seeing, at least in treaties at the international level, countries are starting to account for more of these uncertainties, especially in allocation issues.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Alex. There was a question that was directly addressed from Ida to Clara. Maybe Clara can type in the response. In the meantime, Sigfrido, please, can you check in the chat my email, and then we can pick it up. We can pick up the dialogue by email, especially on what the platform can do. And is there anybody else? Thank you. Please, we're expecting your email. Anyone else from the panel who would like to say something? Melissa, Christian.
I can add a few thoughts.
Please go ahead, Melissa, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think to kind of add on to what Alex was saying, and I think in some respects, maybe this links broadly across some of the different questions, is that like looking forward, I would really argue that many of these agreements and how we're approaching transboundary waters is thinking more flexibly and adaptively. So we're building the institutional capacity in place through these agreements, but allowing for communication and building these relationships and processes. And so in my own work that wasn't particularly related to the talk that we're talking about today and thinking about effectiveness of cooperation, we really see that relationship building and creating effective processes are most important for effective cooperation. And so it's less about the specific instruments and more about building these connections. So I think with respect to, you know, the example on Sudan and Egypt and Ethiopia and the conflict that's going on there, and I realize this is a, you know, to build a better relationship is a very idealistic answer to that question, but I think really it does get down to the relationships we can build, gaining trust, increasing the political will, and I think that will also help us in addressing climate change in the future, because we'll have the ability to respond to these challenges rather than not having that in place. And so I think to kind of address several of the questions at once.
Thank you so much, Melissa. This really helps again. I'm really sorry about that. We are a minute away from 35, so we have to wrap up and close. However, please consider the fact that I sent you my email and the website of the UPWCD as an invitation to continue the dialogue. All the speakers are affiliated to members of the UPWCD, so please do not hesitate to remain in touch through the website and by writing to me. And then we will pick up questions or explore grounds for collaboration in the future between professionals or between institutions. People are still exchanging emails and questions in the chat. But so before we leave, I'd like to thank everyone who stayed with us for this hour and a half. Thank you to all the speakers. Thanks to all the speakers for their super presentations. And thanks for the staff of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association for their help and their technical support. And have a good day or a good evening wherever you are on the planet. Stay safe and save water. Okay. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.